Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Chamber Foundation's breakout session, Building Digital Resilience and Cybersecurity. My name is Vince Fossey. I'm Executive Director for Cyber Policy and Operations at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's session. As a reminder to all panelists and participants, this session is on the record and open to the press. I'd like to now introduce Brian Harrell, Assistant Director for Infrastructure Security at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, to moderate today's session. Brian, over to you.
Well, thank you, Vince, very much. I have the easiest job today. I get to monitor really a bunch of rock stars and some folks that many of you already know their names. So thank you very much for joining us today at the 9th Annual Private-Public Partnership Conference. As Vince just mentioned, I am the Assistant Director for Infrastructure Security within CISA. Believe it or not, people at CISA still do wear ties, despite what my boss says. But my background is in industry. I don't come from inside the Beltway. One day I'm going to go back to industry, and really my job is to ensure that when I go back, that I leave this place better than how I found it. And I think we're doing a really good job within CISA providing timely subject matter expertise, products, services, and the ability to have a conversation back and forth between the public sector and the private sector. And so as communities around the world begin to recover from the effects of COVID-19, society grapples with what we're looking at as the new normal and what that might look like. This global pandemic has disrupted nearly every aspect of our daily lives. The way we do business, how we worship, how we receive an education. And these disruptions really uncover our vulnerabilities and really shine a light on the need for total resilience. And that's protecting individuals, preparing communities, and really fortifying some of our critical systems that we have in the critical infrastructure community. So now within its 9th year, Building Resilience through Private-Public Partnership Conference really focuses on the collaboration between private, public, nonprofit sectors to really help mitigate the effects of all disasters, both digital and physical. So this breakout session really explores the urgent need for building digital resilience across the U.S. public sector and presents an innovative yet practical model for doing so. All sectors need dynamic cyber protection plans which consider the inevitability of a cyber attack or compromise and outline the methods for appropriate prevention, detection, response, recovery, and post-incidents forensics. I often say resilience is the governance of uncertainty. And at the end of the day, we must assume that our worst day is right around the corner. And one of the key questions that I have is, have we prepared? Have we developed relationships under blue sky conditions? Have we removed those single points of failure? And have we added redundancy to our systems? Have we exercised our plans? Have we adjusted our response and recovery plans accordingly? And these are some of the major themes and questions that we should be asking ourselves, not only today on this webinar, but really throughout this pandemic and really moving forward as technology takes more and more center stage of our lives. From a CISA perspective, we understand that the threat landscape is shifting. We continue to see the the convergence between physical and cybersecurity. We remain concerned with potential threats from insiders. And we recognize that nation state adversaries find critical infrastructure systems as high value targets to attack. Recently, we've released a number of cyber products, including our Securing Industrial Control Systems strategy, our Pipeline Cyber Risk Mitigation infographic, which was just released this week. And then our newest Cyber Essentials will really highlight having a cyber strategy, making the appropriate investments, and building an awareness program. So today I'm excited to moderate this panel. I look forward to today's discussions. We have a short period of time, so let's go ahead and get started. I would like to introduce our panelists. Joining us today, we have John Zanni, CEO of Acronis SCS, Bill Wright, Director of the Federal Government Affairs of Splunk, and Greg Young, who's the Vice President of Cybersecurity at Trend Micro. Each panelist is going to have between 7 and 10 minutes to provide some remarks. And then towards the end, we're going to do kind of a moderated panel where I have a number of questions to ask our panelists. But then again, if you have some great questions, I'd love to see them in the chat. and I can pass them by to really spur some thought leadership on today's panel. And so with that, John Zanni, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you all for joining this this session. I have a couple of slides that I wanted to show you to set the groundwork. First is just about a slide of who we are. And I'll wait for the slide to come up. Can you see the slide? I apologize. For me, it's a dark screen.
One second.
I'll start talking to save some time, and then you can always look at the slide later. So just a little background on who Acronis SCS is. We're a cyber protection company that is solely focused. There we go. It's up and running. We're good to go. Is solely focused on the U.S. Public sector and protecting the assets of the U.S. public sector. We are based in the United States, specifically in Scottsdale, Arizona. We only have U.S. citizens. We are a veteran employer. Over 20% of my staff are U.S. veterans, and a veteran advocate through a foundation called Acronis SCS Vets that's 100% focused on helping transitioning veterans and military spouses to find jobs in cyber. Everything we do is through certified products and processes to ensure the highest quality products that come out of us, the market. Now, let's talk a little bit about digital resilience. Next slide, please. If you look at what's happening in the market today, before COVID, there was already a fairly significant challenge in ensuring that data and digital assets would get protected from cyber attacks, whether it was malware, ransomware, and such. Now, with the advent of COVID, the confusion, communications from agencies like the WHO and the CDC, people moving to a remote workforce where they are using less secure system has all been an opportunity for bad actors to increase their attacks and be able to profit from this environment. And despite what you might have heard, that some of them said they will not attack hospitals, or they will not attack government agencies that are helping to fight this pandemic, it's all false. You look at the data, and these attacks have increased, and they're coming from very sophisticated and organized and well-funded organizations. If you go to the next slide, I wanted to give you a few examples here. Take a look at the Department of Defense. In January, there was a cryptocurrency mining botnet. If you don't know what that is in some ransomware now doesn't encrypt your system and ask you for Bitcoin. It actually just stays in the background unbeknownst to you and uses your computer's resources to mine cryptocurrency and make money that way. So that's one of the more sophisticated ways that they can essentially generate revenue or income from you without even knowing you're doing it. In February, the U.S. DISA agency suffered a data breach that potentially exposed hundreds of thousands of users. In March, the Department of Health and Human Services was targeted by a cyber attack that wanted to slow the agency's response to the ongoing pandemic. They do this because they know these are situations where people will be more inclined to pay the ransom because of so many lives at risk or business at risk if they don't. And then in April, the WHO reported that they've seen a significant increase in attacks by bad actors, in some cases nation states, in this case Iran. If you go to the next slide, please. Now, no, previous one before that. There we go. Why is this happening? Where is that opportunity? So first, we move to a home environment that's much, much less secure. None of us have commercial grade routers, or at least most of us don't, including me, in their home. A lot of us are sharing devices with other family members who might not have been trained on security skills. I know there are no children in my household that have passed the Security 101 tests that we offer at my company. And some of those devices on home or networks can get compromised and then compromise the corporate networks. I'm sure you've seen on the news Zoom, Teams, WebEx applications that have had to shore up their security just because they weren't designed for this environment where there was no corporate IT to enforce the right configurations to really stop attackers to go after these remote workers. They've improved it, but a defense in-depth model is always best when you are trying to protect your digital assets. Then Verizon published their mobile security index just recently, and I wanted to share a few data points here that I thought were interesting. First, 75% of public sector organizations said mobile devices are critical to operations. What I know is a lot of the agencies also know they cannot afford to give a dedicated mobile device to every employee, which means supporting bring your own device model. 71% said that within 5 years, mobile will be their primary means of accessing cloud-based services. 56% have experienced a major mobile-related compromise. 36% admit that they sacrifice mobile security to get their job done. I was on an earlier webcast today where the webcaster actually said it's better if you don't use VPN so you get better performance, which means compromising security. There's a lot of educating to do yet to really get individuals to understand how easily they can be vulnerable with these digital assets that are critical to businesses. So how do we think about protecting digital assets? Next slide, please. We think in the terms of complete cyber hygiene so that you can guarantee operational assurance. And this should sound fairly familiar to some of you because it's also the way you actually prevent and treat illnesses through prevention, detection, response, recovery, and forensics. So you want to make sure first, if it's a biological virus, that your vaccine and you have good hygiene. This is, in the digital world, it's about vulnerability, patch management, backup with continuous data protection, really proactive cyber hygiene. Being able to detect if something wrong or you're going to a bad website or that you might be vulnerable for or in an attack, being able to respond quickly to that attack and block it. Technology acts the same way as we do with medicine. And unfortunately, eventually, sometimes the attacks do just get through, or a device gets damaged. And in those cases, you need to be able to recover quickly and really understand what happens so that you can mitigate that happening from against. So if you really use that same way to prevent and treat illnesses for cyber hygiene, you're really on your path to think about how to protect your digital assets. And then the next and last slide. So I'll propose of how we think about this model for digital resilience. We call it SAPAS. safety, accessibility, privacy, authenticity, and security. And what does this really mean? Is first, you need a reliable copy of your data that you can recover and that's free from ransomware or other attacks, that you have access to this data anywhere at any time, that you have complete control over the data and where it goes. Do you know where your data is stored? All of it? Very hard to find or figure out in some cases. Authenticity. Has anybody tampered with that data? Are those pictures you've put up there or that document you sign really the document that you get when you download it again? And then make sure that you have the right level of security and protection against cyber threats. If you do this, if you are SAPAS ready or cyber protected, as we say, then you're well along your way to make sure that you have digital resilience. And so with that, I'll hand it back, and hopefully this will give you some food for thought for the next 45 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, John. This is Brian again. Appreciate it. Off to Bill Wright, your view of the world.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Really appreciate it, and of course appreciate everything that you're doing there at CISA. My name is Bill Wright. I'm Director of Government Affairs at Splunk. We are the Data to Everything platform. We turn data into action. We tackle some of the tougher challenges around IT, IoT, security, and of course data challenges. So you'll notice a common theme in my presentation and answers to question, and that is a true belief that the importance of data. As Brian put very well, COVID-19 has been one of the biggest challenges many of us have faced in our lifetimes. It's not merely a business disruption or an economic crisis. In fact, it's both, but also human catastrophe and a stress test on government systems and the government's business continuity plans. It's forced us all to rethink how most of us do our jobs as we all sit here in our respective homes in most cases. The virus has forced us, in a sense, it underscores exactly where we are as a technological society. And I think we are at the dawn of the data age, where digital data can allow us to devise effective, rapid responses to some of these global challenges, like COVID, but not just COVID. I've been accused of being a little bit too optimistic, but with all the negatives ushered in by this pandemic, it also opens up some, I think, exciting opportunities and may accelerate our journey toward a more resilient, connected, data-driven future. I truly believe data can help save lives. Data is essential and will ultimately be what drives true resiliency, digital resiliency, but only if we do it right. So from the federal government to all the members of the chamber to your local grocery chain, we need to accelerate our data use to become more resilient and get everybody back to work here, back to their workplaces, I should say, eventually. The data we need is all out there. We just need to dedicate ourselves to investigating that data and then, of course, acting on it. I think one of the core principles to resiliency is around IT modernization. And I think this last couple of months has really proven that out. I think COVID has acted as an overdue and perhaps unwanted catalyst for IT modernization across the government. It's important to recognize just this massive transformation that has occurred within our government over the last few months. According to the Washington Post, only 40% of federal employees were set up to work from home prior to the outbreak. Since then, we have seen a Herculean effort. What many people, I think, don't appreciate is just the scale involved in that. Millions of workers, the sheer complexity, how many agencies were on legacy networks that the government was still operating. So personally, and speaking for Splunk as well, we have tremendous respect for what our federal partners have managed to accomplish. One data point here to paraphrase our former US CIO, Suzette Kent, those organizations that invested in modern technology, specifically cloud and the shared services model, allowed those organizations to be more nimble during the pandemic allowed them to pivot and scale, making them, in fact, more resilient organizations. It's not to say there weren't bumps along the road. Many of those made the news. Those organizations were still weighed down by legacy systems and they struggled. But during this transition period, two problem spaces or areas, I think, came up and that we were hearing from our customers. On the remote work side, how do I enable remote work in the right way? Manage the capacity needs of my organization? How do I monitor, ensure that performance is at that acceptable level? And of course, how do I do this securely with such a huge increase in attack surface with all the remote workers and new devices, as John really well laid out in his presentation. I would also note that state and local governments have been particularly vulnerable to cyber attacks during this time. Second area of concern and questions and problems that we were hearing is around the massive uptick in digital demand for the government. During this time, citizens are relying on government now more than ever and more than we had ever imagined, frankly. So think unemployment sites, small business loans. How do we prepare for that surge in digital services that our citizens are using and demand? What I would say, and an observation, is both of these problem areas, I think, at their core are in fact data problems. And if I have the right information at my fingertips at the right time, I can make rapid data-driven decisions. So when you take a step back and view this pandemic from a little bit back and our response to it, almost all these problems are data problems. Decision makers or policymakers need the right data at the right time to make confident decisions to carry out their mission. And I think a good example of this is something that we're doing at the state level. So Splunk recently signed a deal with a US state to help them track and monitor COVID-19. So this state is using Splunk COVID-19's dashboard to track the current status of the virus across the state and provide data analytics to drive tactical decisions by the state's governor and, of course, the Department of Health officials. Splunk's also being used by the same state to ensure that the 30,000 person workforce who've suddenly been asked to adapt to work remotely can stay online and deliver these emergency services to the public. Lastly, the same state is using Splunk to help quickly scale overburdened system. The state's unemployment system, for instance, has seen a 10-time increase in unemployment applications. So we're helping their IT move more efficiently. So that's my view of the world. Data and modern technology have got to be core to our strategy on digital resiliency. And I look forward to folks' questions and to hearing from the other panelists. Thank you, Brian.
Oh, you're welcome, Bill. And thank you very much for being here. We appreciate your thought leadership and what it is that you're doing as a company to try and move America forward. Greg Young, I guess to you, my friend from Trend Micro, your view of the world.
Yeah, thanks very much. And there's really good comments. Thanks to our fellow panelists. It's been great. You know, I learned in the Army a couple of lessons. One was that any food that's boiled in a bag is probably going to be really bad. And second, under stress, you really kind of learn an organization's people's capabilities. During the last few months, I think we've seen a remarkable revolution in the public-private partnerships, especially on the behalf of governments interoperating with the private sector in response to this. You know, we've got offices around the world and, you know, a couple of 100 million endpoints under visibility. And we learned some lessons there. So one thing I saw was that the sort of the movement of the partnerships really changed quickly, where it was typically, you know, government-led, industry follow in a lot of these committees and especially around digital infrastructure resilience, really quickly became a partnership. And in many countries, many jurisdictions also became a real partnership. We saw some changes, for example, such as the role that internet exchanges played within this. And that was kind of a surprise, I think, to many of the participants. We know the internet's there. We know kind of how it works, of course, but we faced some really interesting challenges around the world. One was staff getting physical access to the internet exchanges, for example. those buildings were owned by third parties who put in policies during COVID that said, right, nobody goes into the office. Well, these are critical people. Well, they're not the government. They're not police forces or medical. So no, you're not critical. And in many cases, these exchanges don't want to advertise where their locations are for security reasons. So those are some big surprises. As we saw this revolution in home, work at home suddenly happen, there was some surprises there and some not. The biggest one, I think, was around the economic factors that said, hey, many people are just not set up for it. Companies were competing to get even laptops ordered for staff. And we saw some real security implications of this. So the better organizations and federal departments who reacted quite well did things, for example, like they really provided security above and beyond for the home workers. So they recognized that it was not only the organization provided equipment, but the home equipment would need protection just as much. They're leaving this nice bubble of the home office or the work office, and you're coming to a home environment, which is probably one of the best attack surfaces going. You've got insecure routers, you've got teenagers and spouses who don't believe in putting security software on devices, and they need protection as well. So I think that expanding that bubble was really part of, I think, one of the lessons. Many organizations gave licenses for software, or they already had licenses and didn't recognize it for multiple devices per employee. So that was useful. Also helping out partners and suppliers as well. Suddenly, their staff are going to be working at home, communicating onto your networks, contractors and the like, making sure that they're included as part of this bubble. That sort of employment status is no longer a big factor. It's really, these are all part of your network, and there's a great democratization there suddenly going on. So I think there's some good lessons there as well. And other across the supply chain, even for providing secure storage. Staff and their, will find ways to, store stuff in the most efficient way. A private Dropbox is not a great thing to use. Instead, give staff the storage they need. Expand to enterprise editions of these storage devices to at least have it observable and securable by the organization. So some really good lessons there. Really great reaction on the part of the private sector for some URL takedowns. As we saw, many COVID-related scams or ransomware distribution ones, masquerading as payment plans or unemployment applications. Some of the most noteworthy tech companies out there did actually a really good job in reacting quickly alongside government partners in doing those URL takedowns. That was at lightning speed too, so that was a real success story. As we look across, I think the other aspects that we've learned from this, there were some remarkable surprises about the resilience of the internet. We saw some real challenges, for example, when there was popular game downloads happening or updates, just when staff went to work from home. That sounds trivial, but it actually resulted in noticeable degradation for many organizations in performance, especially as they all moved to Zoom, Zoom and other platforms really quickly. And behind the scenes, it did in fact stress out a lot of the infrastructure in some countries and jurisdictions. So there are some great lessons there. I think some tech companies learned some lessons as well. Those who are starting to bring employees home or back into the office from home, and they had to reverse their infrastructure quickly. And that provided an opportunity for scammers and attackers as well to try to attack employee helplines. As they're trying to get connected, as they're calling in, the level of security dropped in many organizations as they were willing to forego a lot of the checks and validations they would do to make sure somebody who's requesting a password reset is in fact that, work at home employee and not somebody trying to take advantage of stressed help desk staff. So it's been an interesting period, but most of it's been very optimistic. I also think the resurgence we've seen in use of, software as a service, some, Fed, state, local organizations moved very quickly to that through necessity, and the wheels didn't fall off. So it's been, I think there's been some unintended benefits from this bad experience we've had, but there's certainly a lot of security lessons we're still learning today.
All right. Well, Greg, thank you very much. Thanks to the panelists, John, Bill, Greg. Appreciate your time and your thought leadership on this. So we've come now to, I guess, the fun part, which is question and answer period. And so let me remind everyone that to submit a question via the hub chat and the webinar, please go ahead and do that. I think you'll find it off to the right there. Feel free to type in your question, and I'll be able to see it and hopefully make topsy-turvies of it and try and get something smart out to the panelists. And we already have one, and it's actually really good, and it's a bit of a trend already that I'm seeing. And that is, how is the cyber workforce adapting to these increased attacks? Are companies able to maintain the workforce needed to protect themselves from such attacks? And I guess really at the end of the day, it's about, we're in this degraded environment. Everyone is working from home. It's a new normal. Is the subject matter expertise still there? Is everyone still fully engaged? Are we as situationally aware today than we were just 6 months ago? And from a workforce perspective, are we better? Are we the same? And do we pivot really as a country moving forward from a workforce perspective post-COVID?
Yeah, Brian, I can jump in with a comment here. I think this is a great question, and I think you just said that it's beginning to be a trend. I completely agree. And I think a part of building a resilient organization like this, your personnel and your workforce is truly going to be a challenge. People are an important part of any mission, but most agencies, if not all, are short, especially during COVID, when organizations are working hard to keep that minimum physical footprint in the security operations centers and elsewhere. These security operations teams, especially during COVID, are facing what I would say exponentially growing volume of security events. And as the federal budget moves forward over the next few years, post-COVID, I would imagine our federal partners are going to be asked to even do even more with less in the future. So I would say one observation, I think that the tech community's made a lot of strides around automation and automating process, especially around security automation. Unfortunately, relatively few organizations are using automation capabilities. I was just reading a 2019 study by Ponemon that revealed only 23% of organizations are leveraging automation to any significant degree. That means that 3/4 of organizations are still relying on manual operations, which make it more difficult for organizations to manage these security events. All that burden falls to the already understaffed cybersecurity teams, exacerbating those problems related to skills gap and workforce shortages. So effective and sustainable cyber resilience, I think, really hinges on increased automation. And these security automation tools exist. They can act as a force multiplier for existing security and IT operations teams. And at the end of the day, security automation tools can really clear out a lot of that routine, repetitive tasks and free up our personnel to do what they do best. And that's to go after a lot of the hard problems. So orchestration, automation tools, I think, are a core pillar of any comprehensive approach to cyber resilience. And these concepts, I think, are probably even more critical during this COVID time response.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. And John, if you don't mind, same question, but I love if you wouldn't mind just kind of drilling down just a little bit. What do you think the impact has been on small and minority businesses, specifically tribal businesses, as they try to assess the impact of their systems and their workforce? Any thoughts on that?
Yep, absolutely. So the good news, and I think Greg and Bill alluded to this, is there's definitely an increased awareness that you need to be more secure. And the move to the cloud, at least from the government side in the last few months, has just been fantastic. Definitely exceeded my expectations of what they would be capable of doing. The bad news is that we have old systems, or the government has old systems. Some of them don't talk to each other. There's a need for expertise to really understand how to use the tools that are out there. We have some very good tools, for example, but without the experts to know how you configure those networks and set up those backup plans and have those antivirus systems, it becomes more difficult. I can tell you that the number of cybersecurity jobs in the United States grew by close to 50% since COVID. The gap is around 600,000 open positions. It's one of the reasons we started Acronis SES Vets, because I learned that actually U.S. veterans have a natural propensity to work in the security space. They're just missing some of the official certificates needed to get those jobs. And so we've been working to help fill that gap. I'd say what we're doing might be just a drop in the pond, but at least it's something. For those minority organizations or tribes, they have the same challenge. And so they need those tools that are reasonably at reasonable cost, relatively easy to use, so you don't need somebody with a PhD to figure out how to secure your environment, and just some basic guidance. The thing is, if your systems are up to date and you have a good antivirus system and good backup and recovery system, you're 80% of the way there. So that's my thoughts on it.
Yeah, thank you, John. Greg, before we move on, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, a couple of quick ones. I think we've lost some visibility in the last few months. As more employees move to unmanaged devices for privacy reasons, a lot of organizations haven't been able to manage them as closely or carefully. Plus, they're shared in a household. We've lost some visibility there. Also, more encrypted pipes, more VPNs now than there were previously from the outside. So we've lost some visibility there. So I really like Bill's comments about automation, better using the people that we have today for the exciting work, not things that we can, have automation use. But we definitely need greater pools of information to base those security decisions on there and to link them. And we're seeing some great work through, machine learning and moving towards AI to do that. On the personnel side, what has not advanced is how we hire, train, and advance people in the cybersecurity field. Got some incredible resources there, but I think we've got some medieval hiring and advancement, and just how we bring these people into the organization. So any leaders out there, I would really encourage you to revisit how you do that and maybe sort of reinvent the wheel.
Mm-hmm. Greg, you kind of read my crystal ball here on the next question. And to the larger group here, what aspects of resilience do you believe would be the most impactful to the public sector? And really, for example, would resilience be most impacted by personnel, as you've just kind of alluded to, Greg? Is it new technology? Is it funding? Is it acquisition? Is it making the right investments? Inevitably, the answer is all of the above. But if you have your next one incremental dollar in which to invest, where are you going first?
I can jump in here. I think the sort of the MVP of this COVID response has been around IT modernization, movement to the cloud. I think those organizations that invested early in cloud and SaaS offerings, again, found themselves in a much better place, more nimble, more quickly able to pivot and able to scale. Those organizations that relied on their sort of legacy tools and networks suffered and have had a tough time coming back. So I think it's been a tough lesson, but I think going forward, IT modernization across the board is probably the key pillar to resiliency going in the future.
I would agree. We have to remember that the bad actors are not kids in a dorm room that are just bored on a Saturday, right? These are nation states, heavily funded, organized crime. They're using the same technology we are to innovate, artificial intelligence, machine learning. They have it all, which means that unless you have tools that are supplied by the experts who are really thinking about how to provide digital resiliency, you just can't keep up with these bad actors. So I would say that is the most important first step, is really to take it, modernize your IT and take advantage of those latest tools.
Yeah, my next dollar I would spend on correlation and discovery. And by that I mean about $1 in 6 or $1 in $8 now spent on IT is spent outside the CIO's organization. So anyone with a credit card can buy enterprise or government IT resources suddenly and put it somewhere that may not be secured. So never has there been more need for this. We see people move, applications move, servers move, infrastructure moves now, and it's all in an Etch-a-Sketch. So we can secure that with discovery and correlation, but also having to put some prevention in there as well. And I think there's also a good opportunity for this, public-private partnership aspect, bringing the two cogs together of government and private to share lessons there. Every hour I've spent on a committee or in an organization meeting like that has always been worthwhile.
Sure. Building off of some of what John just said, how has the use of cloud and other SaaS offerings enabled businesses to continue to work to secure some of their remote settings?
Yeah. Interesting. I think that, when you make the case for cloud, it was always recognized that, from a financial standpoint, that there were some benefits. I think that the realization now is that the benefits go well beyond financial. I'd say specifically the ability to set up new cloud-based solutions when the on-premise data center may not be accessible, which has been the case. Fast access to real-time data to influence these rapid decisions that I discussed. I think those are two primary benefits to cloud and SaaS offerings that we've seen over the last couple of months.
I would add, I'll give our company as an example. The way we built our infrastructure, we used a zero trust model. So there's a network only for employee or company-owned devices, a network for employees who bring their own devices. Instead of depending on VPN, every application we access requires dual-factor authentication through approved authenticators, which means that when we had to move to 100% remote, it was completely seamless. It just worked, and it just happened. You could call me a genius for having done that, or just really lucky. Only time will tell. But that's made a huge difference. It means we didn't miss a beat when we went 100% remote on March 13th, I believe it was.
Some real rich dialogue that's happening in the chat box, and I appreciate it. One of the themes I'm picking up on is surrounding cybersecurity standards. And I'll be honest with you, I cringe just a little bit as a recovering regulator, somebody who's done a lot of standards in the past. But can you outline what cybersecurity standards used in the professional world that need to become the primary steps in the next version of maybe that common home network protections to protect the telework vulnerabilities? Is there an evolution? Is there a maturation to some of the cybersecurity standards that are out there now that maybe somebody like not me should be focused on in regulating down the road?
Well, not allowing you to use your child's name as a password would probably be a good start. Or I logged into my home router this week just because I had trouble connecting to a new smart scale, and it turns out that router, the original password and user was admin and password. The words admin and password, right? So that's an example where every router made by this version of Netgear has the exact same username and password. So these are the kinds of very simple things that we could bring into the consumer world that we just don't do in the business world that would radically make the networks more secure.
Yeah, and I would add that those common username and passwords, of course, are all available on Shodan and some other sites. So certainly a huge vulnerability, but I think you're right. There are some perhaps simple steps that can be taken with the manufacturers to ameliorate those.
Yeah, and it seems more so in the United States, because like I know I have some friends who live in France, for example, and when they got their router, they had a big long number in the underneath the router that they had to type in, which was actually quite annoying, but at least you knew that no one was going to guess that number. Right. Which here, I don't see that happening in the US.
Yeah, standards are challenging. I think for, company policies to set standards for staff is the really key one. Really take care of your home first. And by that, I mean sort of a one-pager, policy, very human readable, understandable, not a binder. And bombard your staff with kindness in terms of the tools. Don't make them go jump through hoops to get a new router because the one they have is known to be insecure. You know, and even, you know, what we've seen, for example, in supply chain, you know, we've seen some terrible things in medical devices where the inability to patch them has been a real issue. So just making patching things, you know, easier, help your staff stay up to date. If they need newer software, if they need security software, just, you know, make it available to them. What I was alluding to in that supply chain comment, by the way, it was interesting that we found that there was, you know, a reselling of medical equipment going on where they were putting new barcodes on it to make it appear to be a newer version, which they could resell for more. And when it came time for security to try to patch these Internet of Things medical devices, the patches would brick them, much like trying to put a Windows 95 or Windows 10 patch on a Windows 95 system. So all these issues, you know, once we started to get really distributed, it really come home. So, you know, whatever devices you're giving your staff, you know, just clarity for that, and just, you know, not making it really hard to talk to security about them.
In the chat forum here, I think we've opened up the door surrounding regulation. I'm a little timid to go inside, but you know, one of the questions was asked, you know, and I'll paraphrase here, but you know, we have some cybersecurity regulation. We have NERC-CIP, we have the light touch in the chemical sector, we have some in the financial sector. Given the rise in cyber attacks, do you foresee more stringent regulations coming down the pike? And that's where the question ends. Let me just add some commentary. You know, regulation isn't the answer to everything. However, a rising tide lifts all boats. Is there some truism? Is there some wisdom to additional regulation, or do we think we're good? Do we think we just need to add flexibility, best practices, et cetera, to move the needle on this? Or do we really need to come up with a black and white checklist mentality kind of regulatory program?
Well, Brian, you mentioned truism, and if there's one truism in Washington, it's that technology moves much faster than policy ever will. That to me is the challenge in creating good cybersecurity policy, that by the time you have it, and as you mentioned, a checklist, technology and cyber attacks and cyber attackers have now moved beyond that. You know, that said, I think you know, there may be some room in some specific industries for regulation. I think I've been saying with each major cyber attack that oh gosh, we're going to have you know, data breach legislation coming down the line. I think I started saying that 7-8 years ago, and here we are. So I don't see anything in the immediate future.
Yeah, I think, you know, just to jump in here from the Chamber's perspective on the regulatory front, I think what we expect, you know, certainly out of the NDAA process are several key provisions that could go a long ways in further enhancing the public-private partnership between industry, critical infrastructure, and government agencies like CISA and others. You know, key among them will be, you know, Chambers endorsed, you know, the position of a national cyber director. That's an important one. We've endorsed CISA's subpoena authority to provide critical infrastructure owners and operators with key vulnerability information that they are not able to otherwise glean from internet service providers. And there's a number of others that I think could go a long ways in enhancing and really changing kind of the risk model and the risk calculus to critical infrastructure, the business community at large. And, you know, frankly, there's a role for regulation, but regulation in and of itself is poorly attuned to and poorly calibrated to such a dynamic threat as cyber is.
I think FIPS 140 is a great example of an enabling standard that helps businesses. You know, have been very, very successful in making our cryptography more secure. You know, as it's aged, it hasn't aged well in one way, which is that, you know, as we have to change software and when we find bugs in it, because we're so good at finding vulnerabilities nowadays, organizations were afraid. They say, I'm going to be using, you know, a non-FIPS approved version, but I know this one is free from vulnerabilities. So what do we do? And, you know, and the FIPS standards folks are evolving, and they're producing a third version that's going to handle that, you know, sort of a ramping of changes. So I think there's some good stuff out there we could use better.
John, regulation, the boogeyman or helpful?
No, it's a bit of both, right? So without the tools to help implement those rules, it just gets hard for people to do it. The other part is we haven't really talked about classification of data. You know, if somebody takes a picture of me and puts it on the internet and gives me blue hair instead of black hair, it might be annoying, but it's not the end of the world. If my medical data is published there, that could be more problematic, right? I know I've had my identity stolen a couple of times due to leakage of my social security number and such, and it's really annoying to have to deal with that. And so we do need regulation, especially for critical infrastructure, critical data, and then make sure there are the tools they can abide by it. Because without the tools, then it's just writing on paper that no one can implement.
All right, back to resilience, but I'm enjoying the provocative conversation here. So across the public sector, are there specific programs or organizations that you feel exemplify this approach to dynamic planning and resilience, organizations that may serve maybe as a good role model for others? I don't want to, throw anyone under the bus. I don't necessarily want to gloat on anyone either, but there's some key foundational organizations or groups out there that are just doing a great job.
I'd like to call out maybe MITRE, the MITRE attack framework as a group, nonprofit that's really helped advance our understanding of how attackers work and helping organizations and governments respond very well to it. So, shout out to MITRE for helping us model the attacks that the bad guys do better.
John, Bill, any thoughts?
Yeah, I don't want to call out any particular agency, but I know there are far more positive stories in sort of the COVID response time than there are negative. I mean, you look at the effort that came out of just one agency. Look at DoD. I think they brought 900,000 workers to work online in a short, essentially overnight. Incredible. You have to hats off, and if you think about how that went all the way across all of the agencies, I mean, really is incredible. That said, those organizations that had modernized their IT, in particular around cloud and SaaS, had an easier time, and those that did not struggled. But there are good lessons to take all the way across.
I heard two examples at a DoD webcast just last week. The US Navy, pre-COVID, had 10,000 VPN lines. They now have 250,000. So wow. Within a very, very short period of time, they were able to enhance their IT infrastructure to be able to handle the remote workers. Really impressive, right? That's nightmare. Kind of orders from your boss to say, I know you have 10,000 lines, now I want 250,000. The SBA, the Small Business Administration, they went from 0 virtual desktops, so VDI, to over 5,000 within a couple of months as well because of COVID. These are massive, complex implementations that went really fast. And both of them, to your point, Bill, said the reason we could do this is because we had already planned to move to the cloud and had some experience. And so it was really accelerating what we were already doing versus starting from scratch. So that made a big difference.
A question from the mind of Brian here. I come from industry, and I know we had an epiphany back in the 80s and 90s where we really started to focus on safety. And we had that safety moment where investment and training programs were all very wrapped around this idea of safety, making sure that when our people go out, they come home that night, they're not killed, they're not injured, they're not maimed, et cetera. How do we move industry now towards a culture of security and a culture towards resilience? How do we make that investment justification? How do we articulate to the chief procurement officer, or the chief operating officer, or the chief executive officer that this is wise investment in cyber and digital resilience? Yes, they see it on the news just about every single day. But from a dollars and cents perspective, what are the key words and the tricky phrases to mention to them to really move the needle on digital resilience?
I think one of the key factors is going to be, really stating a clear business case and remove from them the fear that it's going to be shelfware. I think we've been our own worst enemies in security in terms of, putting forward solutions that aren't practical or usable. But if it's going to have a real business case and a bit, not necessarily dollars, but in terms of, for example, taxpayer value or impact on citizens, really state that clearly. And if there's going to be a negative impact, if security has to get in the way, being upfront about what that's going to be and show your work that you've done all you can to mitigate that.
Mm-hmm.
I just say panels like this, constantly talking about it, repeating it, being transparent about breaches. One of the challenges in state and local is they'll get a ransomware attack and won't disclose it, which means then they can't get the funding they need to get the technology in place to actually make sure it doesn't happen again. So there's a real need to be transparent about the effects of not being protected and the cost.
Yeah, and one of my sincere hopes is that one of the effects of this COVID time period is that, at least for industry, that this resiliency becomes a C-suite issue. I think it will. I mean, it affects the bottom line and the absolute existence of the organization. So I think it's going to get the attention it deserves going forward.
Well, how do you think we find that right approach that ensures resilience without any disruption of productivity? It's obviously a balance there. When we make the investments, we're making investments in modernization, but there is a risk there that we need to try and avoid, where we might potentially introduce a new system that maybe we didn't beta test well enough and it takes our system offline and there's an operational impact. Where do you think that balance is, and how do we ensure that we do not have a loss of productivity?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that is key, finding that right balance, identifying those efficiencies that'll come from IT modernization and balancing that risk on moving forward. Where that fulcrum point exists, I think depends on the organization itself and their risk, perhaps their risk for tolerance in this case.
John, Greg, thoughts?
Tolerance of risk.
Yeah, I certainly don't advise you hacking the board or hacking the officer. Don't do that, you kids at home. I think there's that whole issue of experience, the customer or citizen experience is a big part of it. And that goes beyond just sort of that initial application. When we look at, for example, with, the electronic voting or, voting machines is part of that. Security goes beyond just the device. It has to be that whole supply chain, has to be, the start to finish. And I think a lot of the security cases we make too often to management are just about that immediate cost and immediate impact, not looking at life cycle, and especially retiring stuff. I really like that question you asked earlier on about, where you're going to spend your next dollar, because my automatic reaction is, what about the other $9 I've spent already, and how can I maybe retire some of those to get more of those single dollars?
Yeah, I would agree the same. I'll just add an anecdote. I do have a customer who wanted to know if we could still protect Windows 3.1.1 devices, right? Now I was around at Microsoft at the time, so it put a smile to my face, but at the same time, you're putting yourself at risk if you're using technology that's that old. Big risk.
Our last question, I guess, because we have 10 minutes and, kind of answer the question, but then maybe just some parting thoughts and comments from our panelists here. We can go to all three. What do you think the largest challenges are in increasing organizational resilience? What are the pain points? What are the gaps? What are the issues? And then, again, want to thank everyone for participating, but your parting thoughts for maybe some thought leadership, something that our participants who are listening in right now can pull out of their back pocket tomorrow to make their program more hardened, more secure, and more resilient.
Well, I would say, cloud being and move to cloud and seeing how it resulted during this pandemic is important. So making that case that it's not just moving to cloud doesn't just save money, but that there are a whole lot of other benefits, including the ability to be nimble and to pivot and to scale during these times of crisis.
I would just add that there's a fixed bucket of money agencies, businesses have. So I understand you can't just throw out everything and start from scratch, but there are some small steps you can make, like patch management, keeping your systems up to date, making sure you have a good antivirus system or a good backup and recovery system that are not that expensive, that would really get you started on that path. And security from the beginning by design. It just can't be any more an afterthought. It just can't.
Yeah, for me, as you move to cloud services, the cloud is only going to be as secure as you make it. It doesn't come out of the box secure. So, organizations, as they move there, you can achieve whatever level of cloud security you want. You just have to plan for it. One of the encouraging signs we've had in the last while is that a lot of the content we're seeing read now is long form. And by that, I mean people are studying more, they're doing more planning. And it's a great opportunity to fix those problems in security you had and move forward. You've got permission now to do it. So take the planning and maybe be a little more, fast in your plans than you were previously. Because we've got the time to plan right now. There's resources and executive will to do better in security. So, I think as a security community, a lot of that is now in our laps.
All right, I want to thank our panelists, John, Bill, and Greg. Appreciate your guys' leadership. Where you are trying to take the industry. We're all in this together. It's not just a government thing. It's not just a private sector thing. It's collective defense, and we need your input just as much as the government needs the private sector's input. And it's a big, giant circle, and it's very cyclical, and I appreciate it. I do want to turn it over to our hosts. Vince, dare I say, rich conversation, one of the better of the day. So thank you very much to the Chamber for having us.
Brian, thanks very much, and thanks to all the participants for joining this afternoon's breakout session. Just to put a final point on it, you asked a question, I didn't pipe up, but I think CISA is one of the best partners that the business community has had over the past several weeks and months. Between you and Brian Ware and Director Krebs have been terrific partners through your stakeholder engagement, through providing timely, actionable, and fiercely relevant resources that have made significant impacts to operations across the country, and certainly in our North and South American supply chains as well. So on behalf of the Chamber, our members, thank you. And thanks to everyone for tuning in this afternoon. The conversation continues. Please feel free to reach out to any of us here at the Chamber, and we look forward to continuing the dialogue. Thank you, and we're adjourned.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.